My brother yelled at my daughter and struck her across the face for ruining his wedding pictures. The crack of his hand against her cheek seemed louder than the music that had filled the garden only seconds earlier. Conversation stopped. Glasses froze halfway to lips. Even the photographer lowered his camera. My daughter Emma stood perfectly still in her pale blue dress, one trembling hand pressed against her reddening cheek. Tears welled in her eyes, not from pain alone, but from confusion. All because she had stepped backward during a group photo and left a tiny muddy footprint near the edge of my brother's bride's train. "You've ruined everything," he shouted loud enough for every guest to hear. Then came the second betrayal. My parents turned to me instead of him. "You need to apologize on her behalf," my mother said firmly. I looked at my daughter's shaking shoulders, took her hand, and quietly replied, "Absolutely not." Then we walked away while the cameras kept flashing behind us. My name is Daniel, and for as long as I can remember, my younger brother, Michael, had been the center of every room he entered. He was louder, sharper, and endlessly confident. People mistook confidence for character and volume for leadership. My parents certainly did. When we were children, Michael broke windows and I apologized to neighbors. He missed deadlines and I stayed late to help him recover. Somewhere along the way, our family quietly assigned us our roles. Michael made messes. I cleaned them up. No one ever said it out loud, but everyone lived by it. When he forgot our mother's birthday, I bought the gift that saved the evening. When he nearly lost his first business contract through carelessness, I spent 3 weekends fixing the paperwork while he accepted the praise for securing the deal. I told myself family worked that way. You helped each other. You kept score with strangers, not with blood. The only person who never treated me like I existed to make life easier for everyone else was my daughter, Emma. After my wife's death 6 years earlier, the two of us became our own small team against the world. She inherited her mother's kindness and somehow managed to keep it despite everything life had already taken from her. She thanked waiters, remembered birthdays, cried during animal rescue commercials. The idea of anyone intentionally hurting her felt impossible to me. Michael knew that, which was why watching his hand strike her face at his wedding felt less like anger and more like a message, a reminder of where he believed she stood in the family hierarchy, a reminder of where he believed I stood too. For the first time in my life, I decided not to absorb the damage and move on. I simply stepped aside. And sometimes when you stop holding a structure together, you discover what was keeping it standing in the first place. The call started before we had even reached home. First my mother, then my father, finally Michael himself. None of them asked how Emma was feeling. Not one of them mentioned the handprint that had stayed visible on her cheek for hours afterward. Their concern centered on photographs, guests, and embarrassment. "You know how stressful weddings are," my father said during one call, his voice carrying the careful patience people use when explaining something obvious to a child. "Your brother overreacted," my mother admitted moments later. "But Emma should have been more careful around the dress. Should have been more careful, as if a frightened 11-year-old had committed some calculated offense." Michael's message arrived that evening. No apology. No explanation. Only a single sentence. "I expect you to fix this before people start talking." I stared at the screen for a long time before locking my phone and placing it face down on the table. Across the room, Emma sat quietly with a book open in her lap, turning pages without reading them. Every few minutes, her fingers drifted unconsciously toward her cheek. That hurt more than Michael's message ever could. Over the next 2 days, the family group chat filled with wedding photographs. Smiling faces, champagne glasses, sunlight caught in white flowers. In every picture, there was a carefully protected version of reality. The missing guests were never mentioned. Neither was the reason we were missing from them. Then my aunt sent a message beneath one of the photographs. "Such a perfect day despite the little drama." Little drama. I noticed nobody corrected her. Nobody asked how Emma was recovering. Nobody questioned why a grown man striking a child had somehow become an inconvenience, suffered by everyone except the child herself. For years, I had mistaken silence for peace. Now I was beginning to understand that silence can also be a form of permission. And my family had been granting Michael permission for most of his life. The turning point came 3 days after the wedding. Michael called just after sunrise. For the first time in years, there was no confidence in his voice. His luxury wedding venue had posted the official photographs online the night before, and the comments had started appearing almost immediately. Guests who had witnessed the incident were asking why Emma and I had disappeared halfway through the reception. Others were asking a far more uncomfortable question. Why had a grown man hit a child at his own wedding? Someone had answered. Then someone else had confirmed it. By morning, the story had spread further than Michael could control. Sponsors connected to his growing real estate business had begun asking questions. One client postponed a meeting indefinitely. Another requested clarification regarding recent events. For the first time, consequences had arrived at Michael's door without me standing in front of them. "I need you to tell people this has been exaggerated," he said quietly. "Not Emma is okay. Not I'm sorry. Only damage control." I looked across the room at my daughter, who was carefully covering the fading mark on her cheek with makeup before school. And in that moment, I understood something with perfect clarity. Protecting Michael had never protected my family. It had only protected him. So I simply said no. Then I hung up. I didn't call anyone back. I didn't argue in family group chats or defend myself against relatives who suddenly became experts on keeping the peace. Instead, I did something I should have done years earlier. I stopped protecting Michael from the consequences of being Michael. As a financial compliance consultant, I had spent nearly 15 years helping companies identify risks before those risks became disasters. Patterns mattered in my profession. And Michael was a pattern. Promises made casually. Deadlines missed confidently. Problems handed to other people with the expectation that someone quieter would solve them. Usually that someone had been me. Over the years, I had reviewed contracts for his property business, introduced him to clients who trusted my judgment, and vouched for him in rooms he never could have entered alone. Not because I worked for him, because he was my brother. That ended the morning after the wedding. I politely informed several long-term clients that I could no longer personally guarantee or oversee projects involving Michael's company. No accusations. No speeches. Just professional distance and complete honesty. I also withdrew from 3 ongoing advisory arrangements that I had, quietly managed behind the scenes for years. For the first time, Michael would be standing entirely on his own work. Nothing more. Nothing less. It wasn't punishment. It was gravity. And eventually, gravity reaches everyone who believes someone else will always catch them before they fall. The first crack appeared a week later. One of Michael's largest clients requested a new project manager after learning I was no longer involved with his company. 2 smaller investors quietly followed. No announcements were made. No accusations were exchanged. People simply adjusted their expectations. Michael had spent years borrowing credibility that wasn't his. Now the loan was being called in. My parents noticed the change before they understood the reason behind it. Dinner conversations became quieter. Phone calls arrived later in the evening and lasted longer than usual. My mother's voice carried an uncertainty I had never heard before. Meanwhile, Emma slowly began to look like herself again. The books returned to the living room floor. The laughter returned to movie nights. One evening, she asked, almost casually, "You weren't angry that we left the wedding, were you?" I set down my coffee and looked at her. "No," I said. "Some places stop being worth staying in." She nodded as though she understood more than any child should have to. A month after the wedding, Michael called again. This time there was no anger. No demands. Only a long silence before he finally asked, "Did you do this?" I looked out the window for a moment before answering. "No, Michael." Another pause. "You did." And for the first time in his life, he had no argument left. The family meeting happened 6 weeks later. My parents invited me over under the familiar promise that they just wanted to talk. The moment I walked into the living room, I knew better. Michael sat beside the window, looking older than I remembered. My mother twisted her wedding ring around her finger. My father stared at his untouched coffee. For years, I would have entered that room, already preparing to fix whatever problem waited for me. This time, I simply sat down. "Your brother is struggling," my mother said carefully. I nodded. "I know." The silence that followed seemed to confuse them. My father cleared his throat. "You've made your point." I looked at him for a moment. "My point?" "By stepping away from the business." There it was. Not concern for Emma, not regret for what happened at the wedding. Only consequences. Only losses. Michael finally spoke. "I made a mistake. It was the closest thing to accountability I had heard from him in years. "You hit my daughter," I replied quietly. The room fell silent again. Not because they disagreed, because for the first time, someone had refused to let the conversation move past the part that mattered. Families survive on stories they tell themselves. "He's under pressure. He doesn't mean it. That's just how he is." The problem with those stories is that eventually someone has to pay for them. Usually it's the quiet person, the reliable person, the person everyone assumes will forgive first. People should care about that because almost every family, workplace, or friendship has someone carrying weight that nobody notices until they put it down. And once they do, everyone discovers who was really holding things together. That afternoon, I stood up, took Emma's hand, and left the house. No one asked us to stay. For once, no one expected us to. Autumn arrived slowly that year. The mark on Emma's cheek disappeared long before the memory of that afternoon did. But memories heal differently than bruises. They fade around the edges first, becoming stories before they become scars. We settled into new routines. Smaller holidays. Quieter birthdays. Fewer phone calls. For the first time in my life, peace wasn't something I negotiated for everyone else. It was something I protected for the two of us. Michael's business survived, though smaller than before. Without shortcuts, introductions, and invisible support, it became exactly what he was capable of building on his own. Strangely, I didn't feel satisfaction watching that happen. Only clarity. As for my parents, they eventually stopped asking when things would go back to normal. Normal had been a system where one person absorbed the cost of everyone else's choices. I wasn't interested in rebuilding that version of our family. One evening, nearly a year after the wedding, Emma and I were walking home as the sun disappeared behind the trees. She slipped her hand into mine and asked, "Do you think people can change?" I thought about that for a moment. "Sometimes," I said. "And if they don't?" I squeezed her hand gently. "Then you change the distance between you and them." She smiled and looked ahead. So did I, because the quietest revenge I ever took wasn't making my brother lose something. It was finally refusing to lose myself so he could keep winning.